Chris is probably watching this, so if you are, hello. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Sure he is, Mr Speaker. We'll get into it now. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. In March, the Prime Minister said the government had been working on personal protective equipment for months. Last month, the Aged Care Royal Commission said the shortage of PPE in aged care was, to quote them, deplorable. Can the Prime Minister confirm that between March and August this year, his government received 2,865 PPE requests from aged care providers, but rejected over half of them, leaving residents and frontline workers more vulnerable as a result?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the Minister for Health can update the House on those matters.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm very happy to answer this on behalf of the government. The advice that I have is that, of course, the government during the course of this year has acquired over 500 million masks in what has been a global shortage. At a time of extreme global shortage and a spike in demand, we've been able to maintain that air bridge for the nation as well as engage in domestic production. In particular, that has seen already 78 million masks have been dispatched from the National Medical Stockpile, according to the rules of the National Medical Stockpile. With regards specifically to aged care, the National Medical Stockpile has provided aged care facilities with approximately 18 million masks, 5 million gowns, 11 million gloves, 4 million goggles and face shields, 90,000 bottles of hand sanitisers and 160,000 clinical waste bags. The time frame that I have is that between the 18th of February 2020 and the 20th of October 2020, the Department of Health received requests and responded to 1,769 requests for PPE with dispatches, and very significantly, all requests from providers managing a COVID outbreak were approved. In addition to that, all requests for assistance outside of outbreaks, where aged care providers could not source PPE to meet a clinical need, that is, to manage some form of outbreak or similar item, were met. So 100% of the complying requests were met, according to the terms of the National Medical Stockpile, and there are no cases that we are aware of where any complying request was not met, and we did this on the basis of the medical advice, and we did this on the basis of the advice of the AHPPC, the medical expert panel which has guided Australia through this. So the provision of personal protective equipment has been one of the most significant and important achievements of this government. We have seen the outbreaks. We have seen the collapse across Italy and Spain and France. We've seen the shortages in New York and the United Kingdom in relation to PPE. And against that background, these provisions have been consistent. They have been done on the basis of rules set by the medical experts, and we have met all of those requests which met those requirements.
The member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister explain to the House how Australia's unique response to the global COVID-19 pandemic and recession has positioned Australians to be more confident about their futures?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ryan for his question, and like all members in this place, I thank him for his leadership in his local community as we have moved through this most difficult of years. A global pandemic, something that last year at this time none of us would have imagined over the course of this year, and this would have been of our experience right across the country, let alone all around the world, Mr Speaker. A global pandemic that has caused harm on a scale almost unimaginable around the world, Mr Speaker, but here in Australia the impacts have been very significant, and that is what has always guided our response. A global pandemic, but very local effects, with very local impacts, and a very Australian response, Mr Speaker, to this global pandemic to ensure that it was uniquely suited to Australia's circumstances. This response, Mr Speaker, began with understanding what the nature of this threat was. Of course, there was the severe and significant health impacts of the pandemic. And at the start of the pandemic, there were many unknowns about how great those health risks were. But not only did we understand that the pandemic would have significant health impacts, we knew that equally, Mr Speaker, there would be significant economic impacts as well. A global pandemic had the very strong likelihood, even at those early stages when little was known, that that could lead to a pandemic recession. And indeed, Mr Speaker, that is what occurred. And so from the start we always said there are twin crises to address here, and that is what framed our response from the very beginning. We activated the pandemic plan, Mr Speaker, right at the start of the year, a pandemic plan that had been prepared many years ago for these very purposes. A pandemic plan that called the pandemic, indeed before the World Health Organisation had made that same call. We pulled together the National Security Committee immediately to guide the response. We drew on the expert advisers, both at a state and a federal level, as we framed the responses for the months ahead. We drew on a world-class health system right around the country, a health system that has stood up to the challenge that has been placed upon this country by this pandemic. We pulled together our federation in a way that has never been seen in this country through the National Cabinet. And now that National Cabinet, Mr Speaker, supported by a series of other working groups on everything from working on regional Australia to the health impacts, to skills needs of Australians, working together as a federation, leaders coming together for the first time on 30 occasions, Mr Speaker, in just over about 7 months. We used the strong balance sheet that we built up coming into this crisis, Mr Speaker, to extend the largest lifeline to livelihoods and lives this country has ever seen. This has served the country well, Mr Speaker, and this approach will continue to serve our country well.
The member for Oxley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. I refer to the government's $715 million Australian airline financial relief package. Has any taxpayer money subsidised Clive Palmer's electioneering in Queensland, including his visits to Townsville?
I'll hear from the Leader of the House on this.
The
Leader of the House, yeah.
The member put some asserted facts which just couldn't possibly be inside the knowledge of the minister.
I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business in a second. I'll just say in response to that point, whilst that is a valid and logical point to make, the history of question time is that the Speaker can't judge what a minister should or shouldn't know, and as I've said during the course of this week, the question may seem just the Minister for Education and the member for Kingston. Yeah, that's right, and I'm glad they designed ante-rooms that you might be able to chat in. So that there's a long history that speakers can't judge it unreasonable what's being asked, but I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. To the point of order, the question goes directly to the use of taxpayer money. It refers to the government program where taxpayer money would be coming from, and asking whether or not it's being used for that purpose of electioneering in Queensland. The question is about the payment of taxpayer money.
Members will cease interjecting. Yeah, look, the Leader of the Opposition. The question is in order. The Leader of the House.
With respect to the second part of the question, which spoke to an individual's described as electioneering in Queensland, I mean that is impossible. Literally impossible for the minister to know.
Member for Lingiari.
What a person does in a place is surely outside any possibility of the minister knowing, and outside his portfolio.
No, I'll rule on this. I'll rule on this now and try and rule more clearly, perhaps, which is, if it involves a minister's responsibilities, and clearly it's a program with taxpayers' funds, it does involve a minister's responsibility. The question can be asked. Without denigrating the question, it can be entirely unreasonable for a minister to carry that knowledge. But since I've been pushed on it, that is why we have questions without notice that can be answered on the spot or can be taken on notice. And it was a very common practice 40 or 50 years ago. It's less common today. Otherwise, you wouldn't have that capacity, and whole swathes of questions would be ruled out of order. So the question is in order. I was worried about another aspect of it, which is the Queensland election having nothing to do with us, but I think there is that linkage there with taxpayers' money, and the question's in order. Deputy Prime Minister.
This is a good program. It's helping operators right around the country to have planes in the air. Planes in the air means jobs on the ground. Even for Clive Palmer. And we do not discriminate. And how could I possibly know, Member for Oxley, what Clive Palmer spends his money on? And these are rebates. These are waivers. There are 1,360 operators, including those who are donors to the Australian Labor Party. And I don't ask them to refund the money. I don't ask them to forego any waivers, and nor do I ask any of the operators out of Ballarat Airport to forego the waivers, to forego the rebates. Many donors to the Labor Party, one in particular. I'm not going to ask for a refund from them, and I don't know what Mr Palmer spends his money on, nor should I.
The member for Cowper. The member for Cowper has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how Australia's unique response to the COVID-19 pandemic is supporting regional Australia's recovery?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
How good it is to get a question about infrastructure and a question about regional development from a real Member of Parliament. Thank you, Member for Cowper. Fantastic question, well asked and about to be well answered. Our budget was a budget for the regions. We delivered a plan and a pathway which positions Australia to recover and grow from what has been a once-in-a-lifetime event. This pandemic has hit our nation hard and hit particularly our regions hard, but our regions are strong. People in the regions are tough. Our investment extends to every one of the 537 local government areas across the nation. The Local Roads and Community Infrastructure Program delivers benefit to every council, no matter where they are. These communities are very well represented by the member for Cowper. These communities, they're receiving $15.4 million to kick-start local projects, such as the V-Wall precinct upgrade, which is having concrete poured right now by Nambucca Valley Council. Now, a project made possible through $310,000 granted under this program. And this is just one of 2,100 projects already approved to date. And we are getting on with not just small projects such as that, which makes such a difference, local workers on the ground, local procurement, but also large projects. Beginning construction in 2015, North Connects is a transformational project. It is opening this Saturday, linking the M1 and M2 motorways via a 3-lane tunnel under Pennant Hills roads. Now, we've put $412.3 million, but those numbers are big. Those numbers are big, but what they don't tell is the story that this project will bypass 21 sets of traffic lights between the motorways. It's diverting 5,000 heavy vehicles which use Pennant Hills roads per day, reducing operating costs and boosting productivity for freight operators such as Jim Pearson Transport. Now, it started in the member's electorate in Port Macquarie. It's been operating since 1978. Jim Pearson Jr. had this to say, Mr Speaker. North Connects brings long-awaited relief for heavy road transport and the general user. Pennant Hills roads has not been adequate or safe for decades. The new route will remove stress from drivers, provide greater safety, less wear and tear on vehicles and considerable fuel savings. It will benefit all users. And I'd like to acknowledge each member in this place who contributed to that project, but it took a Liberal Nationals government to get on and build it, and that is going to be such a great project for Sydney, but for all users of that particular road. And that's what we're getting on. We're building roads, we're building rail, we're building a better future for Australia. Through COVID recovery, that's what we're doing, getting on with the job.
The member for Brand.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How much taxpayers' money did the Morrison government spend on its High Court intervention in support of Clive Palmer's challenge to Western Australia's border measures?
The Attorney-General.
Well, the usual practice there is, as the member would realise from estimates, that no side of this House has ever given over information with respect to costs where it may prejudice an eventual cost order.
The member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, I, along with others in this place, received a petition from the Game Over campaign, championed by Craig Foster and Sonny Bill Williams with Amnesty International. The petition calls on you to accept the New Zealand offer to take 150 asylum seekers each year from Manus Island and Papua New Guinea. This offer has been on the table for several years now, and all the refugees could have been resettled in New Zealand by now. You have opposed to date, just today, a permanent increase to the old New Start for our most vulnerable. We are in a recession, yet you are prepared to pay an estimated cost of $573,000 per year per person in offshore detention. This is obscene. Prime Minister, will you commit to accepting the New Zealand offer without delay?
The member's time has concluded. The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question. Obviously, the government has worked very hard to get people off Manus and Nauru. Over a number of years, decisions were made by a previous government where people were put onto Manus and Nauru, as you know, and
the member for Moreton is warned.
And the member for Moreton, Mr Speaker, was part of the government where people sadly, tragically drowned at sea, and boats arrived, Mr Speaker. Now, we have worked very hard day and night to get people off. In the case of Manus, we've closed the centre there, as you'd be aware, and there are people who are living within PNG at the moment. Many of them have settled there with jobs, etc. In the case of Nauru, as I recall the latest advice, the number there is down to 134 people. I would be very happy to bring those people off Nauru tomorrow, but I need to manage in a way, as we've said before, where we don't see new boat arrivals, because it's actually the policy of both the government and the opposition that if a new boat arrived tomorrow, those people would go to Nauru. That's the policy of both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, and we don't want that because, as we know, many of those boats don't make it and people drown. Now, on my watch, nobody has drowned at sea, and I've not sent a single person to Manus or Nauru. I got all of the children out of detention, and we have not ruled out an arrangement with New Zealand. I've said that, and I've been very clear. We will work with New Zealand, as we do on many, many issues. We've worked very closely with the United States. To the credit of previous Prime Minister Turnbull, the negotiations with President Trump resulted in an arrangement of about 12 or 1,250 people potentially going from Manus and Nauru to the United States. That number is in the vicinity of 850 or 900, which has been a remarkable outcome, and we will get people off as quickly as possible. But we do know that up in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Vietnam at the moment, there are people smugglers who are attempting to put syndicates together. They are very sophisticated in messaging out through social media every word that I say, that the Prime Minister says, that those opposites say, and they would take money from those innocent men, women and children tomorrow, not caring whether or not those people would get to Australia. And at the same time, over this period, we have been able to bring more migrants into our country through the refugee and humanitarian program.
Minister, will just pause for a second. Minister's concluded his answer, and I call the member. No, it goes to the government side. I'm sorry, member for Whitlam. The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how Australia's unique response to the COVID-19 pandemic is helping families and supporting businesses while ensuring our economy recovers in the face of challenging international conditions? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Wentworth for his question and acknowledge he was a distinguished diplomat for Australia, Mr Speaker. and extensive experience in the private sector as a champion for the technology transition underway. And I congratulate the member for Wentworth for winning the seat of Wentworth again for the Coalition, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, he, like others on this side of the House, understand that Australia has faced a once-in-a-century pandemic. And in response, the Morrison government has provided economic support like none other. The JobKeeper program, the JobSeeker program, the cash flow boost, $750 payments to pensioners, to carers, to others on income support. In total, when you include balance sheet support and direct fiscal economic support, $507 billion, or around 26% of GDP, Mr Speaker, and our support has helped save 700,000 jobs. Now, Mr Speaker, the economic recovery is now underway. 446,000 jobs created over the last 4 months, 60% of which went to women, 40% which went to young people. Consumer confidence now up 8 weeks in a row, back to the levels it was in early March. Consumer sentiment up 11.9% in this month, Mr Speaker, the single biggest increase in a budget month since the series first began in 1974. And I can inform the House that today the NAB business survey was out for business conditions, and it was up for the September quarter by 22 points, Mr Speaker, up across all sectors, and particularly strong in manufacturing, in retail and in transport, Mr Speaker. And I had the opportunity to go and visit the member for Wentworth's electorate and to see firsthand the economic recovery underway. We went to the Blair Street Cafe in Bondi, and it was thriving, Mr Speaker. There were people at the cafe like he hadn't seen in months, Mr Speaker, and he had previously used JobKeeper to support his staff, but now with the customers coming back, he was transitioning off JobKeeper. This is the economic recovery that is now being undertaken across the country as a result of the virus being suppressed, the jobs coming back and the economic support from the Morrison government. Now, Mr Speaker, in the budget there was additional measures like tax cuts for more than 11.5 million people, infrastructure projects brought forward, skills and training, support for apprentices and the JobMaker hiring credit. On this side of the House, we're in favour of creating more jobs, and that is what our record shows.
The member for Whitlam.
Thanks, Speaker. And my question's to the Treasurer. Treasurer, is it acceptable for Premier Investments to pay its Chief Executive, Mark McGuinness, $2.5 million while receiving wage subsidies paid for by the taxpayer?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, as the honourable member will know, the same question was put to the Governor of the Reserve Bank, effectively, when he was at a parliamentary hearing recently, and he pointed out that we want our companies to be profitable, Mr Speaker. But JobKeeper had a specific test, and the JobKeeper test was about turnover reductions, Mr Speaker. It was about turnover reductions, and businesses across Australia have been benefiting from JobKeeper and keeping people employed. And when it comes to whether or not businesses have complied with that test, they are matters for the ATO. They will be followed up. But when it comes to JobKeeper, it's been a very successful program supporting more than 3.5 million Australian workers.
Has the Treasurer concluded his answer? Treasurer has concluded his answer, and I'll call the member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister outline to the House how Australia's unique response to the COVID-19 pandemic is helping to protect Australian lives and livelihoods? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Health.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I particularly want to thank the member for Chisholm, who's been a great supporter of mental health in Victoria through the course of the pandemic. And she's been able to do that by looking across,
member for Chifley.
by looking across the world and to see the tragedy that we have faced outside of our borders. As we speak today, 44.4 million people have been diagnosed with COVID. 1.17 million people have officially lost their lives, and no doubt those figures are greater. By the time we conclude at this dispatch box in 2 weeks, when the parliament meets again, it's likely that those numbers will be over 50 million cases and 1.25 million lives lost. The disease is progressing at a faster rate than ever before. 8 consecutive days of over 400,000 cases, and in the last 24 hours, over 500,000 cases. That means that the challenge the world is facing is growing. Against that background, Australia has had 7 cases within the community in the last 24 hours. 500,000 as opposed to 7. And what that means is that Australia's unique approach has been deeply, fundamentally important in protecting lives and saving lives here. As the Medical Journal of Australia indicated, Australia's approach, our approach, has helped save over 16,000 lives compared with the United Kingdom. But more than that, what we did is, over a long period of time, in 2014 we worked with the Conaghan Health Council to establish a communicable diseases framework for Australia. That played itself out in over 50 exercises since 2017 for emergency response preparation, involving the National Incident Centre. And that also led the World Health Organization to identify Australia in 2017 as one of the most prepared nations in the world. All of that saw the Australian approach of working together through the AHPPC, the containment and capacity measures, lead to the outcomes that we've had in Australia. And I know there are alternative approaches. There are some who would want a CDC or a Centre for Disease Control. That is the American model. That is the American model, and that is the European model. It's the model which has seen 20... No, it's not actually. I can take you through the errors in that statement. But more significantly, I'll table that afterwards and show you.
Member for Ballarat.
Most significantly, if we look at this, in Italy, 24,000 cases in the last 24 hours. In the UK, 24,000 cases. In France, 36,000 cases. In the United States, 81,000 cases. All of which have gone to the CDC.
Minister's time has concluded. Minister's time has concluded. The member for McMahon is now warned. I remind the member for Rankin he's been warned. The member for Solomon.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that of the $5 billion the government announced would be spent on the Northern Australia infrastructure facility in 2015, only 3 cents in every dollar announced had been delivered, nearly 5 years later?
The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for that question. Fantastic to get a question on Northern Australia and our Northern Australia agenda, Mr Speaker. And I can confirm for the member that the NAIF has made investment decisions of some $2.4 billion. $2.4 billion of the $5 billion allocated to the NAIF. But it's not just about the NAIF, Mr Speaker. This is about our agenda for the North, delivering for the people of the North, providing jobs for the people of the North. And once again, those opposite simply don't understand business. Is the member suggesting a project proponent should draw down on a loan at a time they don't need it, pay interest rates at a time they don't need it, pay extra costs at a time they don't need it? We have committed, through the NAIF, $2.4 billion in investment decisions. We will continue to deliver, and in fact, in the Northern Territory just recently, Humpty-Doo Barramundi, Mr Speaker, the famous fighting barramundi from the Northern Territory, Humpty-Doo Barramundi, another commitment for the NAIF, a second loan, and means more jobs into the Territory, more opportunities for the Territory, more opportunities for the North. But Mr Speaker, it is not just about the NAIF. We continue to deliver on roads. We continue to deliver on
to
gas.
the Minister, the question was specifically about that one subject.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very happy to continue to talk about the NAIF and those investment decisions that have been made, Mr Speaker. In the Northern Territory, Merrick's Capital, $37 million loan. The Northern Territory Government Shiplift, $300 million loan. Verdant Minerals, Phosphate Mine, $160 million loan. Northern Territory Airports, $150 million. And as I said, Mr Speaker, the Humpty-Doo Barramundi Farm, another family business that's going crackingly well, $24 million in loans from the NAIF that will continue to drive jobs.
The Minister will pause, resume his seat for a second. The member for Solomon on a point of order.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's on relevance. The question went to how much has been spent out of $5 billion.
The member for Solomon. And no, the deputy member for Solomon can resume his seat. The minister's being entirely relevant to the question. Yes,
much, Mr Speaker. I was actually talking about those commitments into the Northern Territory. I thought the member would be actually interested. But if we move across to the north, Mr Speaker, in North Queensland, and I know the Prime Minister's interested in this one, the North Queensland Cowboys, $20 million towards their centre of excellence. I was there just a few weeks ago. The construction's underway. It's getting close to completion. It will deliver a centre for the people of the north. There is no reason you can't be educated, trained to the same level as other places in the north. That's what we're delivering. We will continue to provide these facilities, jobs into the north, opportunities for the north, and we will get on with the job.
The member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister update the House on how Australia's unique plan to support new and emerging technologies will reduce emissions both in Australia and globally while strengthening our economy? Is the Minister aware of any alternate approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Longman for his question. And as a former small business owner, he knows how important affordable, reliable energy is for small businesses in this country. And he also knows that the key to emissions reduction, to a pathway to emissions reduction, is the development and deployment of new and emerging technologies, Mr Speaker. That means technology, not taxation. Now, Australia's experience has been that when new technologies become economically competitive, then they are rapidly adopted by Australian businesses and households. And we're seeing that happen firsthand right now, Mr Speaker, with the adoption of renewables 10 times the global average in Australia, Mr Speaker, 4 times higher than China, Japan, the US and Europe, Mr Speaker. And we're now focused on unlocking new technologies that will help us to bring down emissions, address the challenges of those new technologies like firming of renewables, Mr Speaker. This is all about setting practical goals for those new technologies, like the goal of $900 per tonne for low-emission steel, Mr Speaker. Now, as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, a plan to strengthen the economy as we're bringing down our emissions is more important than ever. But it's not clear, Mr Speaker, that those opposite all agree. We saw a perfect example of that in this place earlier today when the member for Hindmarsh couldn't name a single Labor energy policy in a 20-minute speech, Mr Speaker. Not a single Labor energy policy. There was no plan for gas. There was no plan for reliable, affordable energy, Mr Speaker. There was no plan for a 2030 target, Mr Speaker, and there was no plan to stay in the Paris Agreement, Mr Speaker. But this week, Mr Speaker, we saw the AWU, the CFMEU and 32 Labor MPs with a member for Hindmarsh in their sights, Mr Speaker. They showed up at an event on Tuesday night where we saw a plan laid out for Labor, Mr Speaker. Now, I'm not sure that the member for Hindmarsh got there, but I'll lay it out for him now. A plan for gas complementing renewables, a plan for coal, a plan for technology and industry, Mr Speaker. That's a great plan. It's aligned with our plan, Mr Speaker. Now, we've seen more constructive policy from the CFMEU and the AWU this week than we've seen from the member for Hindmarsh for 7 years as Shadow Minister. While those opposite fight amongst themselves, we're getting on with the job.
Member for Barton is warned. The member for Griffith.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government has announced and re-announced the failed National Water Infrastructure Loan Facility in 50 press releases spanning 4 years. In this year's budget, the facility was abolished without having written a single loan. Why is the Morrison government always about the photo op and never about the follow-up?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I look forward to working with
the Deputy Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for Rankin will leave under 94A. And the Deputy Prime Minister has the call. Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The budget, which is a plan for the future, a blueprint, a vision for what we laid out for the future for COVID recovery, included $2 billion for water infrastructure. $2 billion for water infrastructure on top of the $1.5 billion that we've got for the National Water Infrastructure Development Fund. And we're getting on with the job of building water infrastructure. And we're working with state governments. I look forward to working with the Deb Franklington Liberal National Party state government in Queensland after Saturday to build water infrastructure in North Queensland. Hells Gate, Big Rocks Weir, Rookwood Weir. Let's get on with that. $176.1 million we've put on the table, and what we've seen, unfortunately, is procrastination and stalling by the state Labor government in Queensland. We'll get on and we'll build it. We want willing partners. Hewenden, McAllister. We go further south. We've got Stanthorpe, Emu, swapped out.
Member for Scotland.
The member.
Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
I know how important that is for water security and for the irrigators at Emu Swamp. In fact, they've put millions of dollars of their own money up towards that project. And I know how important building dams is. Building pipelines, Midiamo, we go to Scottsdale in north-east Tasmania. We're getting on with the job. I can hear the member for Watson shouting out he wanted to take water away from our irrigators. He wanted to take water away from the Murray.
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister will just resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, it was a very specific question. It went to the National Water Infrastructure Loan Facility.
Is it on
50
relevance?
Media releases. It is on relevance. 50 media releases,
no,
not a
you won't
dollar.
repeat the question. The Leader of the Opposition. I've just got to say, sometimes I'm in two minds about these, but on this, no way. That question had a statement, and the question, this is question time, was why is the government about the photo op, not the follow-up? That was the question. So, well, they actually do tape this. I mean, I don't think it's a big deal, Leader of the Opposition. So the question really is wide open, just because it has a statement attached to it at the start. The member had the opportunity to ask a specific question about the program she spoke about, but she didn't do that, and the Deputy Prime Minister is completely in order. I didn't ask you.
Because when it comes to Labor, their actual water policies don't hold water. But I see the member for New England. He's very delighted that we're changing from loan to grants. The Dungowan Dam, Wyangla Dam, those two projects in New South Wales are going to add to water security, are going to help flood mitigation, are going to provide water for agriculture. And if there's one thing that we're going to do and we're striving to do on this side when we've got a plan is to build agriculture from the $60 billion enterprise to a $100 billion enterprise by 2030. Now, there's a 2030 target that is absolutely worth striving for, and we are going to do it. National Farmers Federation very much behind it. And Dungowan Dam near Tamworth on the Peel, that is going to make sure that for those people in and around Tamworth, that dam that they've had since 1958, it is going to replace it. It is going to get on with the job of building agriculture in northern New South Wales. Wyangla raising the dam wall by 10 metres is going to and Dungowan add the capacity for inland New South Wales by the equivalent of 1.2 Sydney harbours worth. So that's water, that's a plan, we're getting on with it, you just talk about it.
Member for Eden – the member for Eden – Monaro. 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 The member for Eden – Monaro Seeking to table press releases? Yeah, no. They're public documents. The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Can the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting and recognising the outstanding work of Australian scientists?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Now, last night we celebrated some amazing Australian scientists, their achievements, with the Prime Minister's prizes for science. Now, this really is Science's Night of Nights, and we would normally be gathering in the Great Hall. Representatives from across this chamber would be there, recognising and supporting the great achievements of scientists right across this country. Now, because of COVID-19, we clearly could not hold the event here at Parliament House last night, but it was held virtually, and that does give the opportunity to those members who were unable to see it live last night to go and watch it, because there are some amazing scientists and their achievements that are being showcased online. And it really demonstrated to us how we have turned to the science community during this particularly difficult time as we look for a way out of the situation in which we find ourselves with COVID-19. Now, the winners of this year's top prize for science were Emeritus Professor David Blair, Professor David McClelland, Professor Susan Scott and Professor Peter Veitch. Now, Professor Veitch is actually from the member for Sturt's electorate. Now, their achievements have been absolutely amazing. That team has been instrumental in the world-first detection of gravitational waves. Now, effectively, these four humble Australians helped prove Einstein's prediction of the existence of gravitational waves about 100 years after he first predicted it. Now, it means that we are now able, through their discovery, to look back to almost the beginning of time and explore parts of the universe that we had only hoped could ever be possible. And of course, there were amazing achievements through our innovators, through our teachers, and I would actually like to make special mention of the winners of last night's teaching awards. That was Sarah Fletcher and Darren Hamley. Now, our science teachers do amazing work. They are inspiring the next generation of students to study science, technology, engineering and maths. And of course, tomorrow is World Teachers' Day, Mr Speaker. Now, as the mother of a daughter who is currently doing Year 12 and will finish next month, I've had the opportunity to meet some amazing teachers, and as a parent, I am really grateful for the work that they have done to support my children and to support every child here in Australia. And to the wider Australian science community, I say thank you to you for the work that you have done.
The member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. During the election, the government announced a $100 million recycling investment fund. The government recycled the announcement on World Environment Day in June 2019 and again in December 2019. Prime Minister, as of last week, not a single dollar has been advanced. Wouldn't it be better to deliver on announcements rather than recycle empty ones?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, it was this government that brought legislation into this place to stop once and for all the export of plastics waste, glass waste, Mr Speaker, paper waste and tyre waste that, Mr Speaker, previously would have gone to other places outside of this country, polluted waterways and other parts of this beautiful globe, Mr Speaker. And what we've also done is ensured that we've come to an agreement with states and territories, first through COAG and then through the National Cabinet, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we partner together with the states and territories who have that responsibility for recycling on the ground across this country. That's been made possible by this government because we understand how important actual projects on recycling are to make them happen in this country. And, Mr Speaker, that is our commitment and that is what we're actually doing. And I'll ask the Minister for Environment to add further the answer.
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm happy to add to the Prime Minister's remarks and underscore our important national waste agenda with some particular remarks in response to the member's question. The $100 million Australian Recycling Investment Fund is administered by the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. The mandate was signed on the 17th of December 2019. There are transactions in the forward investment pipeline, and we're advised that it continues to assess and screen expressions of interest that have been received since the fund was established and are being held as commercial in confidence. Understandably, there have been many inquiries. The timing of any commercial transaction depends, as members would know, on a number of factors, from both project proponents and the CEFC itself. As with all CEFC investments, projects seeking finance through the Australian Recycling Investment Fund must be commercial, must reflect the requirements that we put into the mandate and must deliver a positive return for taxpayers. So what I'm saying to the member for Fremantle is we're taking the time to get it right, to make sure that those investments bring the returns that every taxpayer would expect, and they are being made, understood, studied, and we are on track to achieve them. Most importantly, and it's good to mention that $100 million because recently we've leveraged $1 billion additional investment in waste and recycling with our Recycling Modernisation Fund. So $200 million leverages $600 million in partnerships with states and industry and generates $1 billion of investment, which is more than 10,000 jobs, particularly in regional Australia, over the next 10 years. Genuine microeconomic reform that will transform our rural industries, our regional industries and our waste and recycling sector.
The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the minister outline to the House how Australia's unique response to the COVID-19 pandemic is supporting our farmers and helping to meet Australia's agricultural challenges?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Mallee for her question? And she represents a very proud electorate with a rich history, not only in agriculture but particularly horticulture. And after many years of drought and fire, now COVID-19 has thrown up another unique challenge to agriculture, particularly for the hort sector, around workforce. And traditionally, the horticulture sector has relied heavily on overseas workers. And since COVID-19, we've gone down from over 140,000 working holiday makers down to over 60,000. We've continued to maintain the number of seasonal Pacific workers around the 8,000 mark, but this has put significant pressure on the agricultural sector in farmers being able to get product off the paddock onto our plates and around the world. So in March we could see that there were challenges that were going to lay ahead as we got into the warmer months, and we acted preemptively to extend the terms of those visa holders for 12 months if they worked in agriculture. For those three cohorts, we said to them, if you came and worked in the bush and helped farmers, you can stay for another 12 months. In August, the Minister for the Pacific worked proactively with 10 nations to reopen the seasonal and Pacific worker programs, and today they have got 22,000 pre-vetted, work-ready workers ready to come to Australia to help farmers. Those jobs, but can only be taken once they have been market tested here for Australians to take them up first. But they are ready to come on demand when the states provide the quarantine arrangements necessary that their Chief Medical Officer will allow. So we are ready to stamp the visas, we are ready to support once Australians have had a first crack at that and once we can make sure that the states have signed off on their quarantine arrangements. But we've also said to young Australians that it's important that you go and have a look at your own country. There's no opportunity to backpack around the world, so there's an opportunity to backpack around your country and support farmers. We've accelerated the pathway to youth allowance and ab study for those young Australians that can go out and earn over $15,000. They'll go back to uni ready for O-Week with money in their pocket, and they'll be ready to take on youth allowance when they get back. We've also said not only to them but to every Australian that we'll help reimburse up to $6,000 of your travel costs to incentivise you, because these jobs are some thousands of kilometres away and are very transient. They last for 3 or 4 weeks and move on to another. And we've said to the states in September, please sign up to the Ag Workers Code, because once we have Australians moving, we have overseas workers here, we need them to move between states. If we cannot do that, then farmers miss out. We have an integrated agricultural system, right, particularly across the eastern seaboard, and it's particularly important that the states work together to make sure that we do that in a COVID-safe way. This is our way of facing up to the many challenges agriculture has faced, but it continues to shake them off and continue to move towards that ambitious goal of $100 billion by 2030.
I now give the call to the member for McNamara.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Arts. Why did the Minister tell the ABC that money from the $250 million June Arts package announced with Guy Sebastian was already flowing, when senior departmental officials have confirmed, and I quote, "No cash has flowed"? Has the government told Guy Sebastian why it has completely failed to deliver on its announcement?
The Minister for the Arts.
Well, I do thank the member for his question. The facts are that we've committed $250 million under our JobMaker program for the arts and entertainment sector. Of course, this builds on the over $300 million, $336 million in fact, which has been provided to JobKeeper, to people who are working in what's called the creative and performing arts subsector of the cultural and creative sector. In fact, this year we've announced almost $800 million in additional arts and entertainment funding, on top of $750 million in core funding. And let me explain to the member exactly how the Temporary Interruption Fund, which is a $50 million component of the $250 million JobMaker plan, works. What the Temporary Interruption Fund does is it provides support for screen productions which, in the absence of that fund, were not able to proceed because insurers would not provide coverage against key person risk due to COVID. And that meant no screen finance being released, no TV and film productions able to proceed. That's why we committed $50 million under the Temporary Interruption Fund. That money has been deployed. There are now committed to over 20 productions, and 8 of those productions already underway, people employed, people at work in film and television production. Of course, that adds to our very substantial expenditure on the location incentive program, $400 million, because we're seizing the opportunity that our nation has because of our response to COVID, the fact that we are seen as a place that has good protocols in place. That's why we've had very extensive interest from international productions to come to Australia and start commencing filming in Australia. And indeed we saw NBC Universal announce a commitment to programs like Young Rock and Universal, featuring Young Rock and Irreverent. Young Rock featuring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, an actor with whose oeuvre I'm very familiar, having an 11-year-old son, and he's a very popular actor. It's a popular production. And most importantly, Mr Speaker, most importantly, it's going to generate 1,000 jobs plus 2,000 opportunities for extras in Queensland, and there'll be more opportunities around Australia. So I completely reject the proposition that the funding we've committed has not already been put to work. It has, and Australians are in jobs as a result.
The member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment. Will the Minister outline to the House Australia's unique approach to meeting our environmental challenges, especially through the measures contained in this year's budget?
The Minister for the Environment. Members on my left, the Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Reid for her question, congratulate her on the really strong approach she takes to the environment in her electorate of Reid. I joined her on Clean Up Australia Day on March this year, and she was outstanding. Mr Speaker, from our incredibly unique biodiversity and our close affinity to the ocean as an island nation, through to our rich Indigenous and convict heritage, Australia's iconic environment is part of our national identity. Whether it be through world-leading Antarctic science, preparing to drill a million-year ice core, the management of one of the largest marine park networks, our amazing sea ranges, killing crown-of-thorns starfish, or protecting turtles along the Great Barrier Reef, the Morrison government is committed to protecting and preserving our unique environment for future generations.
Mr Speaker, the Energy Minister mentioned there was no energy policy. I'd like to back
Member
that
for
up. There's no
Shortland.
environment policy either, which is why everyone is making so many interjections when I try to explain our $1.8 billion—
Members on my left, the minister will proceed.
our $1.8 billion in additional investment since last year's budget at this year's budget. We are continuing the Coalition's strong track record on the environment through practical and meaningful action. And I mentioned $1.8 billion over 5 years. We've announced the biggest single investment in Commonwealth national parks, including Booderee at Jervis Bay, where the safe haven for the eastern quoll and the long-footed potteroo is well known to local Indigenous managers of Booderee National Park. They'll receive $23 million for upgrades as part of that package last year. Our World Heritage status for Budgebim, cultural landscapes in south-western Victoria, the first Australian site to be awarded its status solely for its Aboriginal cultural heritage values. This budget upgrades Budgebim and other heritage-listed sites across the country, including on the Ningaloo coast and the wet tropics in Queensland. We are committed to recovery after the Black Summer bushfires, Mr Speaker, and we've just completed workshops to spend $110 million from our bushfire support package across the 7 fire-scarred regions around Australia, bringing together wildlife habitat recovery with community action on the ground and asking those communities how best we can help them recover their incredible, unique natural environment. Our investment in climate adaptation activities is backed by the National Environmental Science Program, $149 million committed for phase 2 of the budget. This is a budget that backs the outstanding contributions of our land managers, our farmers, our land care movement and the commitment of those who live in and are supported by Australia's wonderful natural environment.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. In April last year, the Prime Minister announced 10 industry training hubs in areas of high youth unemployment. But 18 months later, only 2 of the 10 industry training hubs are up and running. Why does the delivery of this Prime Minister never match the announcement?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I welcome the acknowledgement of the delivery of the programs as the member opposite
Members on my
has just
left.
remarked. And this is an important program, and those hubs will continue to be delivered around the country, Mr Speaker. But not only that, Mr Speaker, what we will be delivering is the $1 billion Job Trainer Fund, Mr Speaker. Some 340,000 job training places, Mr Speaker. All states now have signed on. The Minister for Industry yesterday noted that we were still waiting for the Victorian government to sign on, and the Treasurer advised me last night, Mr Speaker, that Victoria has signed up to that Job Trainer Fund. And I think that's a great initiative, and we thank the Victorian government for their support. That's 340,000 places because, Mr Speaker, as Australians are gathering together and they move towards the end of this year and they look forward to next year, the fact that we are creating some almost 30,000 places in higher education, 340,000 places for job training, Mr Speaker, all of these programs working together with the states and territories. I note the interjection from the member opposite, Mr Speaker. The Commonwealth Government is working together with the states and territories to deliver this program of Job Trainer, which was a first, Mr Speaker, in that it was brought together in about 2 weeks. That's how effective the National Cabinet was to get moving on the things that Australians needed in response to COVID-19. Now, Mr Speaker, those opposite will come in here and they'll seek to slag off against JobKeeper, they'll seek to slag off against Job Trainer, they'll seek to slag off against the support for the aviation sector, all measures they came in here and pretended to support, Mr Speaker. What the Australian people know is that this year in crisis, Mr Speaker, the Australian government has stood by them, while those opposite have sneered and they've jeered with snarly performances, Mr Speaker, seeking to undercut the work of the government to stand by Australians this year. I would encourage the opposition, Mr Speaker, to leave the snarls at home and get on with the job, Mr Speaker, of supporting the recovery of Australians from the COVID-19 recession.
I call the member for Canning.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General and the Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the Attorney outline to the House how Australia's unique approach to building a more cooperative industrial relations system is designed to find unique solutions to support our economic recovery from the COVID-19 recession?
The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and for his great service to our country in his previous role. And as the member notes, our industrial system in Australia it's very unique, and with that uniqueness comes unique benefits, but also some very particular and unique problems that have developed over time in Australia. And many of the benefits of the system are obvious. The OECD notes that Australia has the highest minimum wage in the world, the highest minimum wage in the world. And we know that our system of awards sits over the minimum wage. We know that over the award system sits enterprise agreements and over-award payments, that the enterprise agreement system was designed and described by Paul Keating as trying to move people away from awards onto enterprise agreements where there's higher wages, higher productivity. But the system is also complex and it at times operates very, very inflexibly. And that's why the government took, on an emergency basis to this parliament, changes to the Fair Work Act alongside the JobKeeper payments to build flexibilities in. And while we're talking about delivery today, it might be worth mentioning again what I mentioned yesterday, that those emergency changes to the Fair Work Act, which were some of the greatest reforms to that Act in a decade or so, saved hundreds of thousands of jobs. 500,000 businesses said that those changes were either important or essential to maintaining their operation during the COVID-19 pandemic. That delivery saved hundreds of thousands of jobs. And what it occurs to us as a government is that if flexibilities could save hundreds of thousands of jobs during the COVID pandemic, then reasonable, sensible flexibilities that are generated on a cooperative basis can also help grow jobs as we come out of the pandemic. And the unique problems, well, there is no definition of casual employee in the Fair Work Act, even though so much turns on the distinction between a casual or a permanent part-time employee. The enterprise bargaining approval process has become incredibly technical and rigid and is not used anywhere near enough. One example of a very inflexible rule is around part-time employment. So, say for instance in the General Retail Award, you can have a situation that arises very often where an employer might want to provide more hours to a part-time employee. The employee might want to work more hours, but the current award rule means that the offer is, in practical terms, never actually made because there's no flexibility that allows an employee and an employer to agree the terms on which that would occur outside a very narrow range. And through our many working groups, we've heard from people who have said, both from the employer side and the employee side, that this plays out with respect to a number of awards, vehicles, clerks, fitness and many others. Work is not offered and work can't be done because of the inflexibility of the system, and these are things that we need to deal with.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the government racking up $1 trillion of Liberal debt by borrowing money for taxpayer subsidies for private jets, including for Clive Palmer, dodgy land deals at Badgerys Creek, Cartier watches and government contracts for Liberal pollsters, while at the same time the government drags its heels on a National Integrity Commission when they've had the draft legislation since last year? Why do Liberal mates come first and everyday Australians get left behind?
Good question. The Prime Minister has the call.
I'll tell you what we're borrowing money for, Mr Speaker. That's what I was asked about. I was asked about why the government's borrowing money. We've borrowed money, Mr Speaker, to save Australian lives and to save Australian livelihoods. Mr Speaker, when I had the opportunity to move through Queensland, something the Leader of the Opposition didn't dare to do, I note, before the Queensland election, Mr Speaker, he wasn't welcome in Queensland, Mr Speaker, not even from his own side of politics. Mr Speaker, I was very happy to be in Queensland, and as I moved through Queensland, the number of people, of businesses and small businesses and employees and others who would stop me, Mr Speaker, and say to me, JobKeeper, job seeker, Mr Speaker, save my job, save my livelihood, save my business. That was the story from one end of Queensland to the other. And, Mr Speaker, that's why this government has invested some $13.7 in direct financial support and over around 26% of the size of our economy to ensure that Australia recovers from the COVID-19 recession. Now, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party doesn't even know how this recession occurred. They don't even know how we got into it. That's why they've got no clue as to how Australia can get out of it. But we understand it, Mr Speaker, and that's why the budget this year laid out the COVID recovery plan, Mr Speaker, for this country, building on the job seeker and job keeper support, which I admit, Mr Speaker, has come at a great cost and has meant that we have had to go and actually raise those funds in the markets, Mr Speaker. But I can tell you what, those markets provided that finance because of the solid balance sheet and the trust they have in the financial management of this government, Mr Speaker, and because we came into this crisis with a strong balance sheet as recognised by Standards & Poor's. Now, Mr Speaker, this has enabled our government to help Australians in their time of greatest need, a time when they needed it more than at any other time, Mr Speaker. Now, it is disappointing that the opposition cannot join the government in understanding the important steps that needed to be taken, but rather come in here and seek to undermine confidence when Australians know that they can have confidence in their future because of the way our government has responded to them and supported them. Yes, Mr Speaker, we have taken on a burden of debt to ensure that there is a today and a tomorrow and the future in this country for all Australians, Mr Speaker. If those opposite had been elected at the last election, Mr Speaker, then we would not be seeing that, Mr Speaker. This country would have been crippled by taxes and fiscal mismanagement before the crisis even hit, Mr Speaker. There are many people around the country, I have no doubt, are very pleased that when the crisis hit, it was a Liberal National Government that were there to support Australians.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister outline how Australia is continuing to manage our national security interests throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular our strong border measures to keep all Australians safe? Is the minister aware of any alternate policies?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to say thank you very much to the member for Boothby. She's a great champion of all things South Australian, and she does a wonderful job in her electorate. So I'm very pleased to receive the question from her. Mr Speaker, at the beginning of this year, in the National Security Committee, we received many confronting reports and predictions from all of the specialists available to us, the Chief of the Defence Force, the Head of the Australian Federal Police, the Head of the Health Department, the Chief Health Officer, etc. And I think the strongest decision taken by the Prime Minister at the start of this year was to close our international borders, which prevented Australia from going into what we're seeing in Europe at the moment, what we're seeing in the United States, in Asia, in the Middle East. That single act, Mr Speaker, that single act saved Australia from what we are seeing unfold right across the world at the moment. And that act, Mr Speaker, has resulted in us being able to deliver a budget that has helped Australians through this crisis in the darkest hour, to make sure that through JobKeeper and JobSeeker we can provide support to those businesses that the Prime Minister just spoke of. At the same time, Mr Speaker, we have been able to support businesses, we have been able to support people in their jobs, we have been able to support our agencies that keep Australians safe day and night. Now, much of the work that the ASIO officers do, or the Australian Federal Police officers do, or that those officers at the ACIC or the ABF do, right through the night, over the weekend, over Christmas, is never seen by Australians. But I promise you, it keeps us safe in our country and it keeps our interests safe abroad. We make sure that our agencies are properly invested in. We've put more money in this budget into ASIO to make sure that we can deal with the threat of terrorism, which is ever present. The threat of terrorism hasn't diminished with COVID-19. We are still facing very significant threats, and our agencies are dealing with that, including this very day where warrants are being executed as we speak. We are dealing, Mr Speaker, with the reality that we face at our borders. The Australian Border Force, led by Mike Outram, is, I think, leading the best agency in the world in terms of the way in which we've been able to respond at our international borders, both here and where people are seeking to board planes or to hop onto boats to come to our country illegally otherwise. And I can assure you, Mr Speaker, that we are doing this because we have managed the budget well. The strong balance sheet that the Prime Minister spoke about before wasn't just an enabler of us to provide JobSeeker and JobKeeper. It's an enabler of us to be able to spend more money in the Australian Federal Police, and the Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police describes the budget this year as the best in 40. We'll continue to support Australians because we make the right decisions in our national interest.
And I call the member for Gilmore.
Question is to the Minister for Communications. Can the minister confirm that despite announcing $160 million for 2 new rounds of the mobile black spot program in March last year, 17 months later the government had spent just $1.2 million? Is the gap between the government's announcement and delivery a potential danger for the upcoming bushfire season?
The Minister for Communications has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for her question in relation to the mobile black spots program. Some $380 million has been committed, generating a total investment of more than $836 million, which has funded a total of up to 1,229 mobile base stations across Australia. I can further report that as at 30 September 2020, 879 of these base stations have been activated, and more continue to be activated all the time. Now, what's important for the House to realise, Mr Speaker, what's important for the House to realise when getting a full appreciation of this context is what was the starting point, Mr Speaker? What was the starting point? How many dollars did the Labor Party commit to mobile black spots?
The minister will resume his seats. The Deputy Prime Minister is not assisting the Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
It's on direct relevance, Mr Speaker. The question doesn't go to alternatives, and it goes very specifically to the delivery of 2 announcements worth $160 million and $1.2 million being spent. And the minister now wanting to turn to other policies, given the nature of this question, is beyond the realms of relevance.
I'm going to hear from the Leader of the House.
The second part of the question, Mr Speaker, spoke about a proposition that a gap between delivery announcemements and delivery caused danger. Now, what the minister is exposing is the fact that members opposite weren't going to build a single mobile phone tower, right? Not one, which one might think is more dangerous than 800+ mobile phone towers.
Members on both sides, the Manager of Opposition Business.
There are a number of words that the Leader of the House just, I suspect, deliberately omitted when he described what was at the end of that question. They referred to the upcoming bushfire season.
I'll continue to listen carefully to the minister, but I do point out the question didn't ask about alternative policies. What he needs to do, and I believe he has been doing, is relating his material to the substance of the question, but I'll listen to him very carefully, and I do agree with the Manager of Opposition Business to this extent that he's very much on the line, if not leaning over it, but I'll keep listening.
Mr Speaker, the policy context here is the starting point. The starting point. When we came to government, not $1 of public money had been allocated to the provision of mobile coverage in regional remote Australia for 6 years. Not $1. Not $1. And what we have done is committed $380 million. And I make the point that we most recently did announce additional funding because we're getting on with it, Mr Speaker. We are getting on with it. And I'll tell you what we've also announced, $37 million strengthening telecommunications against natural disasters. With $8 million will go to temporary facilities such as SAT cows, satellite cells on wheels and satellite roadmaster trucks to be delivered by NBN. Those will be those roadmaster trucks. Some of those will be available before the end of this year. So we've got on one side of the House a party that did nothing about mobile coverage in regional and remote Australia, did nothing about keeping Australians in regional and remote Australia safe from bushfires in terms of supporting public funding to additional mobile base stations. On this side of the House, $380 million, over 879 base stations funded under this program. The other side of the House, they spent zero. They delivered zero. They committed zero. I tell you, Mr Speaker, 000 has been a long-standing, well-known number in Australian telecommunications. It took this side to turn it into a policy in relation to mobile coverage in the bush.
The member for Grey has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Well, the Prime Minister outlined to the House how the actions the Morrison government has taken to address the unique challenges we face today and in the future that will enable Australians to plan for their futures with confidence as they look ahead to 2021.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Grey for his question. He knows that Australia's comeback has begun. Australia's comeback from the COVID-19 recession has begun. Our recovery has begun. That has been acknowledged, Mr Speaker, not just by the Australian people, but of course the financial credit rating agencies, in particular Standards & Poor's, Mr Speaker. The Reserve Bank of Australia have also acknowledged this, Mr Speaker. Australia's comeback has begun. And that is on the basis, Mr Speaker, of an important comeback recovery plan that was set out by the Treasurer, Mr Speaker, in this year's budget, and builds on the significant decisions and actions taken by this government to ensure that we've been able to move through what has been a very difficult year for all Australians as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr Speaker, some of the most difficult decisions that were taken in the early part of this pandemic is how we had to gear down the Australian economy, Mr Speaker, in those early months. But, Mr Speaker, our government was always committed to ensuring that as we had to gear down the Australian economy, Mr Speaker, that it would not be stuck in neutral, and that we would have to move it out of neutral and gear up again. And that has been the policy of our government as we've been moving to have the Australian economy get into the next gear, to open up again, to move forward and not stay stuck, Mr Speaker, with the restrictions and the other limitations on the economy going forward, particularly into 2021. And the member for Grey's electorate, there are 1,200 job vacancies, Mr Speaker, and we want to see Australians get into those jobs, into the member for Grey's electorate. And the same is true particularly in rural and regional electorates all across this country, as well as through our major cities and suburbs, Mr Speaker. The Australian economy is beginning to recover and there are jobs, and we want to see Australians go into those jobs. And that's why we are transitioning the supports that we have through our JobMaker and JobSeeker programs to get Australians back into those jobs, because I know Australians don't want to be on government support. They want to be in jobs, Mr Speaker. They want their businesses open and they want to look forward to the future with confidence. Mr Speaker, our budget provides that plan. The investments that we've made have provided that support so Australians can go into the next phase. And as Australians gather around this Christmas and they come around as families, I want them to look forward to a 2021 with great confidence, knowing, Mr Speaker, that under this government's policies they will be able to do just that. They'll be having to go to university and training places that are available, to businesses that are open, Mr Speaker, and jobs that have been made available because businesses are open and investing and looking forward again. Mr Speaker, 2021 is going to be far stronger than 2020, and the reason for that is of the great perseverance and commitment of Australians, but it's also because of the great support that they're getting from this government, Mr Speaker. And on that note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.